He thought he lost them forever, until a little girl with his eyes cried outside a school, and everything unraveled. Blake Walker didn't believe in fate. He believed in numbers, in data, in systems and strategies. The world of billion-dollar decisions left no room for randomness, and certainly none for emotions. His schedule was his shield, his armor. Every minute of every day was accounted for. So when his driver took a wrong turn and dropped him 2 blocks from his meeting, Blake was irritated, but not alarmed. He tightened his tie, glanced at his watch, and decided to walk. It was a quiet street lined with trees and old buildings, unremarkable, forgettable. But what he saw next would change everything. He heard a soft, broken sound, almost like a bird whimpering. Curious despite himself, he turned his head and saw her. A little girl, barely 5 years old, sat alone on the curb outside a school gate. She was wearing a white cotton dress and tiny shoes scuffed from use. Her dark hair was braided neatly, and on her back hung a small red backpack that looked far too heavy for her. She held a crumpled tissue in one hand and rubbed her eyes with the other. Her cheeks were flushed, and her lips trembled with every quiet sob she tried to suppress. For a moment, Blake hesitated. He had meetings to attend, deadlines to chase, a life built on efficiency and distance. He had no business interfering. But something about her stopped him. Maybe it was how small she looked against the giant school building, or maybe it was the way she tried so hard not to cry. He approached slowly, aware of how imposing he must seem in his tailored suit and polished shoes. He knelt down beside her, softening his voice. "Hey, are you okay? Did something happen?" The girl startled a little but didn't back away. She sniffled and looked up at him with wide blue eyes, eyes that struck something deep in his memory, though he couldn't place it. She clutched her backpack tighter and said in a trembling voice, "My mom didn't come. She always comes. But today, she didn't." Blake felt something shift inside him. "Do you know your address?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "I forget. It's not far, I think. But I don't know the way." He sat on the curb beside her, loosening his tie without thinking. "That's okay. We'll figure it out. What's your name?" She wiped her nose with the sleeve of her dress and whispered, "Lily. Lily Moore." The name hit him like a punch to the chest. Moore. Julia Moore. It was impossible. No, unbelievable. Yet here she was, this small, scared child with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, saying the name that he hadn't heard aloud in 5 years. A name he'd once loved. A name he had tried to forget. He forced his voice to stay steady. "And your mom, her name's Julia?" Lily nodded and looked at him with pure innocence, unguarded and trusting. "Do you know her?" Blake's mouth went dry. He didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to process what his mind was screaming at him. Julia had disappeared from his life without a word all those years ago. He'd searched for her briefly, then bitterly given up. He never knew why she left or where she went. He never knew she had a daughter. A daughter who might be his. He looked back at the child, his hands suddenly cold. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think I do." Blake stood there for a moment, utterly still, his mind reeling with thoughts that had no shape. Everything inside him, his instincts, his training, the disciplined layers he had spent a lifetime building, cracked just a little. He looked at Lily again. Her tiny frame, the streaks of dried tears on her face, her trembling fingers wrapped around the strap of her backpack. She wasn't just any child. She could be his. The weight of that possibility fell on him like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripple after ripple through everything he thought he understood about his life. He cleared his throat and forced himself to smile, though it felt like his face didn't quite know how. "Lily, would it be okay if I walk with you? Maybe we can find your house together." She hesitated, but then she nodded. "Okay. But what if my mom comes and I'm not here?" "I'll leave a message with the school, just in case," he said gently. "And we won't go far. You can help me remember which way to turn." She seemed to accept that, and together they began walking slowly down the sidewalk. She didn't talk much at first, just looked around anxiously, occasionally pointing to something familiar. Blake listened carefully, prompting her gently, trying not to overwhelm her. With each passing step, the knot in his stomach tightened. He kept thinking about Julia. About the way she'd left without explanation, without warning, disappearing like a ghost. He had convinced himself it was because of something he'd done, or hadn't done. At the time, he was too absorbed in building his company, too ambitious, too emotionally unavailable. She had deserved more. He just never realized how much more until now. After nearly 20 minutes of wandering through residential streets, Lily stopped in front of a small one-story house with peeling paint and a rusted gate. "This is it," she said. "That's our door." Blake scanned the modest house. It was quiet. No sign of movement inside. The curtains were closed, and the front steps were empty. He rang the doorbell. Nothing. He knocked, waited, then knocked again. Still nothing. A flicker of unease rose in his chest. "Does your mom have a phone?" he asked. Lily nodded. "But she said it broke yesterday. She was going to fix it after work." Blake crouched beside her. "Do you know if a neighbor has a spare key?" She shook her head. His instincts screamed that something was wrong. He hesitated for only a second before pulling out his phone and dialing emergency services. While he explained the situation to the dispatcher, Lily sat down on the steps and rested her chin on her knees. She looked so small, so uncertain. Paramedics arrived within minutes, followed by a police officer. They knocked, then forced the door open. Blake stood frozen at the threshold, heart pounding. The living room was neat but sparse, minimal furniture, toys tucked into a corner, dishes in the sink. And then, through the hallway, they found her. Julia lay on the bedroom floor, pale and unconscious, barely breathing. Time collapsed around him. He rushed forward instinctively, his voice hoarse as he called her name. The paramedics gently pulled him back as they began their work. Oxygen. IVs. Fast, controlled movements. Blake couldn't tear his eyes away. He hadn't seen her in 5 years, and now here she was, fragile and silent, like a fading memory come back to life. "She's alive," one paramedic confirmed. "But she's dehydrated, possibly febrile. We're taking her in." Blake turned to Lily, who stood in the doorway, clutching the frame with both hands. "Is Mommy okay?" she whispered. He walked over, knelt beside her, and placed his hand gently on her back. "They're going to help her. She's going to get better." The police officer asked who he was, and Blake hesitated for just a breath before answering, I'm a family friend." It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the full truth. They let him ride in the ambulance. Lily sat beside him, her small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers. She didn't cry. She didn't ask many questions. She just held on, as if she sensed that something massive had just shifted in her little world and that somehow, this man beside her, this stranger, was no longer a stranger at all. As the ambulance sped through the city lights toward the hospital, Blake stared out the window with 1,000 questions swirling in his mind. He didn't know why Julia had left. He didn't know why she never told him about Lily. But now, none of that mattered more than one thing: she was in danger, and her daughter might be his. And no matter how much time had passed, he knew deep in his gut, he wasn't going to lose them again. The hospital corridor was bathed in artificial light, sterile and humming with quiet urgency. Blake sat on one of the plastic chairs near the emergency wing, his elbows resting on his knees, hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor in front of him. Lily had fallen asleep with her head on his lap, her tiny body curled up like a kitten after the emotional exhaustion of the day. He didn't dare move. Every time he looked down at her, he felt a rush of something unfamiliar, protective, raw, and deeply unsettling. He wasn't used to this kind of vulnerability, especially not directed at someone so small and so connected to a life he had let slip away. A nurse came out and spoke his name quietly. He looked up sharply, eyes wide, instantly alert. She told him Julia was stable but unconscious, her vitals improving, and they believed the cause was a severe viral infection combined with exhaustion and dehydration. It wasn't life-threatening anymore, not with treatment, but she would need rest and monitoring. Blake exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. He thanked the nurse and asked if Lily could stay with him for the night, explaining gently that the girl had no other family nearby. After a pause, and perhaps recognizing the emotion behind his calm voice, the nurse nodded and arranged a small cot in a nearby private waiting room. Later that night, when Lily was tucked under a thin hospital blanket and finally resting, Blake stepped out into the hallway and leaned against the wall. His reflection in the glass across from him was worn and unfamiliar. The controlled, polished man he had spent years building was starting to unravel. He couldn't stop thinking about Julia, how she had survived alone, how she had kept this secret, how close she had come to dying without ever letting him know he had a daughter. He called his assistant and cancelled his next 2 days of meetings, something he had never done before. His assistant stammered in surprise, but Blake didn't offer an explanation. For once, he didn't care how it would look to shareholders or partners. All that mattered now was the woman unconscious in the hospital room down the hall, and the little girl who might be his child. The next morning, he requested a private meeting with the doctor and asked if they could run a paternity test. He didn't want to put Lily through anything invasive or frightening, but he needed answers. He needed confirmation. The doctor agreed and arranged for a simple cheek swab that Blake gently explained to Lily as a silly cotton test. She accepted it without fear, though she asked if her mom would be okay again. He promised she would. The wait for the results was excruciating. In the meantime, Blake sat by Julia's bedside every moment Lily was asleep. He couldn't bring himself to talk to her just yet, not with her eyes closed and her face pale under the soft hum of the monitors. But he watched her. He remembered her laugh. He remembered how stubborn she could be when she believed in something, how her hands used to trace invisible shapes in the air when she spoke about dreams and ideas that didn't yet exist. He remembered how she used to make tea late at night and drink it while barefoot, leaning against the window in his old apartment. Now she looked so fragile. But she was alive. And if fate had brought Lily to him like this, then maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to make something right. 2 days later, the doctor handed him the envelope in silence. Blake walked down the hallway with it, his heart hammering so hard he could barely breathe. He sat down, opened it slowly, and scanned the paper until he found the words that made everything go still. Paternity confirmed, 99.99%. He read it twice, then folded it carefully, placing it in his jacket pocket as if it were made of glass. He sat there for a long time, not moving, not even thinking. Just feeling. He was a father. Of a daughter who didn't know yet that her whole life had changed. Of a child who had spent 5 years believing her father was dead. And now he had to figure out how to tell her the truth, not in a way that would shatter her world, but in a way that would start rebuilding something new. He didn't have a plan for that. But he knew this much, he wasn't going anywhere. Not this time. It was nearly evening when Julia finally opened her eyes. The room was dimly lit, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor a soft reminder of reality. She blinked slowly, adjusting to the light and the unfamiliar surroundings. Her body felt heavy, and her throat was dry, but her first thought wasn't about herself, it was about Lily. She tried to sit up, but her body protested. The movement, however slight, triggered the sensors, and within moments a nurse entered the room. Julia's voice was barely a whisper when she asked where her daughter was. The nurse smiled gently and told her Lily was safe, that she was nearby, and that someone had brought her to the hospital just in time. When Julia asked who, she didn't expect the answer. His name is Blake Walker, the nurse said. He's been here every day. He said he knew you. Julia felt her breath catch. Blake. She hadn't heard that name aloud in 5 years, not since she left everything behind. Her mind raced even as her body felt weak. Had he really found them? Had Lily met him? She was flooded with questions, and guilt surged through her like a wave. She closed her eyes, remembering the last time she saw him, his sharp suit, his tired eyes, his voice focused more on expansion and projections than on connection or love. She hadn't left out of spite, but out of necessity. Back then, he was lost in his ambition, and she couldn't raise a child in that kind of loneliness. Hours later, when she had the strength to sit up and sip water, the door opened quietly. Blake stepped inside, hesitant at first, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and a folded paper in the other. He looked different, still put together, but not flawless. His face showed the wear of sleepless nights, and in his eyes there was something she had never seen before, vulnerability. Julia didn't speak first. Neither did he. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the air thick with everything unspoken. Finally, he stepped closer, setting the coffee down on the tray beside her. "You look stronger," he said softly. "I feel like I got hit by a truck," she murmured. "But I'm alive." He nodded and handed her the paper. She unfolded it slowly, and her hands trembled as her eyes moved across the words. The DNA test. There was no need for her to read all of it, she knew what it would say. Still, seeing it in print, seeing the confirmation of what she had hidden for so long, made her eyes fill with tears. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know if I should." Blake pulled a chair closer to her bedside and sat down. "You should have," he said, not with anger, but with quiet pain. "But I'm not here to punish you. I just needed to know. And now I do. I didn't want her to grow up being part of a world that would forget her. You were so far away, Blake, emotionally. You weren't ready for her. And I was scared. I was scared she would just be another thing on your calendar." He lowered his head and rubbed the back of his neck. "I probably would have been. Back then. I was a machine. Everything had to fit into some plan. But when I saw her crying outside that school, I didn't think about meetings or the market. I just saw a little girl who needed someone." Julia studied his face and realized how much he had changed. He wasn't perfect. He still looked exhausted, like he carried too much inside. But he was here. And that mattered more than anything. "She doesn't know," Julia whispered. "She thinks you died." Blake's jaw tensed, and his eyes glistened. "I know. She told me. And I didn't correct her. I didn't want to confuse her. I thought, maybe when you were ready, we could tell her together." Julia nodded slowly. She reached for his hand, weakly, and he took it without hesitation. It was the first time they had touched in years, but it felt as natural as if no time had passed at all. Neither of them spoke for a while. They didn't need to. In that quiet room, with monitors beeping softly in the background, something old broke apart and something new quietly formed. They had been broken, yes. But they were not beyond repair. Lily sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her legs swinging slightly above the floor, a picture book open in her lap that she wasn't really reading. The lights were softer now, the air no longer tense with fear but thick with questions neither of them had asked yet. Julia watched her daughter from the chair nearby, still weak but stable. Every time she looked at Lily, she felt both overwhelming love and aching guilt. It had been 5 years of holding a secret she could barely carry, 5 years of looking into her daughter's eyes and telling her a version of the truth that was easier to live with than reality. She had always thought she was protecting Lily, but now she wasn't so sure. Especially not after Blake had walked back into their lives and looked at Lily as if she were his entire world. Blake arrived quietly, holding a small bag of snacks and coloring books. He knocked lightly on the frame before entering, giving Julia a look that asked permission. She nodded. Lily looked up and smiled, already comfortable with him in a way that confused and amazed Julia. He sat down beside her, placing the bag on the bed, and Lily immediately rummaged through it, choosing a glittery purple pencil and a notebook. She didn't say much, but she didn't need to. Her comfort around Blake was growing every day. There was no resistance, no distrust, just a quiet curiosity and instinctive ease that couldn't be taught. Julia leaned her head back and closed her eyes briefly. Blake turned to her, his voice low. We should tell her soon. Not just who I am. The truth. All of it. I know, she said, still not opening her eyes. But how do you tell a 5-year-old that the man she thought was gone forever is sitting next to her drawing unicorns? He didn't have an answer. Neither of them did. That night, after Julia had fallen asleep again, Blake stayed with Lily in the hospital room. He read to her, laughed with her, and helped her build a makeshift fort out of spare blankets and chairs. It wasn't anything extravagant, just the kind of thing kids remember when they feel safe. As he tucked her in, Lily looked at him and said, "You're not like the dads in my stories. They're always wearing superhero suits or flying. But you're here every day. Even when it's boring. That's better." Blake felt something shift in his chest. It was one of those comments that sounded innocent, but meant everything. It was then he knew he couldn't wait much longer. She deserved the truth, and if it came from him, he had to say it with care. He didn't want to be just a name or a sudden presence. He wanted to be her father in every real way. The next morning, Julia sat Lily down beside her on the bed. She looked nervous but calm, her hands gently smoothing her daughter's hair as she began to speak. "Sweetheart," she said carefully, "do you remember how I used to tell you that your daddy couldn't be with us?" Lily nodded, a little frown appearing on her face. "Because he went to the sky." Julia blinked, swallowed hard, and glanced at Blake, who sat quietly a few steps away. "That wasn't true," she said slowly. "I told you that because I didn't know how to explain something really grown up and complicated. But the truth is, he's right here." Lily turned to Blake, her eyes wide and confused. "You're my daddy." He nodded, emotions tightening in his throat. "Yes. I am." For a long moment, Lily just stared at him. Then she looked back at her mom, trying to connect the dots in her mind. But, why didn't he come before? Blake got up and walked over, kneeling so he was eye level with her. "Because I didn't know about you," he said gently. "I didn't know I had the most amazing little girl in the world. But now I do. And I want to be here. Every day. If you let me." She didn't answer right away. She simply leaned forward, wrapped her small arms around his neck, and held on. Not tightly. Not dramatically. Just honestly. That was all the answer he needed. The weeks that followed moved with a strange rhythm, somewhere between recovery and rediscovery. Julia was discharged from the hospital with strict instructions to rest, and Blake insisted on helping with everything, refusing to let her return to the small, worn-down house alone. He arranged for a rental apartment in a quiet, well-kept neighborhood, furnished it himself with care and subtlety, not making it extravagant but making sure it felt warm and safe. Julia protested at first, out of pride and uncertainty, but when she saw Lily's face light up as she explored the little bedroom filled with books and cozy blankets, she softened. It wasn't about luxury. It was about starting again. Lily adapted quickly, as children often do, though every now and then she'd stop in the middle of coloring or brushing her teeth to ask a quiet question like, "Are you still going to be here tomorrow?" or "Did you miss me before you knew me?" Blake never lied. He answered every question with truth wrapped in love, never giving her more than she could hold, but never hiding from her either. He spent hours learning what she liked, what made her laugh, what frightened her. They built pillow forts and made pancakes that turned out lopsided. He picked her up from school and sat in miniature chairs during parent meetings. He read bedtime stories he didn't understand and let her draw rainbows on his expensive work folders without flinching. Julia watched it all unfold from the sidelines at first, still unsure if this was something real or just a momentary burst of guilt and obligation. But Blake didn't falter. If anything, he became softer, more human, the farther he stepped away from the towering empire he'd spent his life building. He answered calls less often, turned down meetings more frequently, and even skipped a major tech summit to take Lily to her first ballet recital. The man who once thought love was a weakness now let it guide every step. Still, there were moments of tension. Julia had built her life alone for 5 years, and now there was another adult making decisions. They argued once, quietly but sharply, about Lily's bedtime routine. Another time about whether she should go to private school or stay where her friends were. Each disagreement came from a place of care, and eventually they learned to listen, not just to speak. Blake wasn't trying to take over, he just wanted to be part of the whole, even if it meant unlearning how he'd always done things. One night, after Lily had gone to bed and the apartment was wrapped in quiet, Blake found Julia on the small balcony, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the dark skyline. He brought her tea without saying a word and sat down beside her. For a long time, they didn't speak. The city stretched out below them, and the stars blinked in the sky above. "I thought I was protecting her," Julia finally said, her voice low and even. "From you. From the life you were building." It looked like a world with no space for mistakes. No space for children. Blake rested his elbows on his knees and looked down. It was. Back then. "She used to ask me why other kids had dads and she didn't," Julia whispered. "I'd tell her all families are different. But I never believed it when I said it." He reached over and gently touched her hand. "You did the best you could. And now, I want to do the same. I don't want to make up for lost time. I want to be present for every moment ahead." Julia turned to him, eyes searching his. "And what about us?" He held her gaze. "One step at a time. I'm not asking to go back. I'm asking to move forward, whatever that means, for you, for her, for us." For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to carry everything alone. And she didn't answer with words, just leaned her head against his shoulder, letting the silence between them speak for something fragile but real. Something beginning again. As spring settled over the city, something shifted quietly within the lives of all three of them. The apartment, once just a temporary space for healing, began to feel more like a home. There were drawings taped to the refrigerator, mismatched socks in the laundry basket, and stacks of children's books beside Blake's laptop on the kitchen table. He had begun working from home more often, attending only the most critical meetings in person and spending the rest of his hours surrounded by soft footsteps, giggles from the hallway, and Julia's occasional teasing remarks from the kitchen as she tried to recreate old recipes she used to make when they were together. Lily thrived. She had always been a bright, imaginative child, but now her eyes sparkled more often, her laughter rang louder, and she carried herself with a growing confidence that hadn't been there before. She told everyone at school that her daddy made the best pancakes and could carry her with one arm. Sometimes she'd bring home crafts and insist that Blake hang them in his office, which he always did without hesitation. It wasn't just play or performance, he meant every part of it. He was building something solid, day by day, moment by moment. Julia watched the change in both of them with a strange mix of joy and caution. She had learned not to trust peace too easily. For years, she had braced herself for disappointment, for absence, for people walking away. It was how she had survived. But the man who now read bedtime stories beside her daughter's bed didn't seem like someone preparing to vanish. He was different, not because he'd become softer, but because he had become more present. He listened more, spoke less, and showed up even when it wasn't convenient. One evening, as Lily slept soundly in her room, Blake and Julia sat across from each other on the living room floor, sorting through an old box of photographs she had kept hidden away. There were pictures of Lily as a baby, sleeping on Julia's chest, laughing in a plastic tub, clumsily chasing a balloon through the living room of their old apartment. Blake held each one carefully, as if afraid they might vanish if he blinked. He looked up at Julia, a quiet ache in his eyes. "I missed all of this," he said softly. "Every first. Every little thing. I don't know how to live with that." Julia leaned back on her hands, her voice calm but firm. "You don't have to live with it. You just have to live beyond it." It was a simple sentence, but it struck him deeply. There was no judgment in her tone, no accusation, just truth and grace wrapped together. They sat for a long time like that, lost in memory and possibility, surrounded by small snapshots of a life that had once seemed impossible to share. As April turned into May, Blake began making quiet plans. Not grand gestures, not elaborate declarations, just small, consistent decisions that would mean something real. He called his lawyer and updated his will to include Lily. He opened a savings account in her name and began setting aside time each week that was solely for her, no work interruptions, no phones. He also began speaking more openly with Julia about the future, not pressuring her, but including her in the idea of it. One night, as they walked together through a quiet neighborhood after dinner, Lily skipping ahead of them chasing fireflies, Julia reached for his hand and held it without a word. Blake looked over at her, surprised, but didn't ask why. He didn't need to. It was enough. For the first time in years, they were walking side by side toward something instead of away from it. The past still lingered, of course, like a shadow at the edge of their days. There were wounds that hadn't fully healed, and questions that didn't always have answers. But in the space between fear and forgiveness, they were learning to build again. Not a perfect family, not a flawless story, but a life stitched together by choice, not circumstance. And that, Blake thought as Lily ran back and threw her arms around both of them at once, was something worth holding on to. Summer arrived slowly, warming the city with golden mornings and soft, endless evenings. The air felt different, lighter, more forgiving, as if even the world around them had decided to soften its edges. Blake could feel the change in every corner of their lives. The apartment had evolved from a temporary solution into a quiet sanctuary, where the days moved with gentle certainty, and laughter became a familiar sound. He had never imagined himself in this kind of life. For years, success was measured by deadlines, earnings, and power. Now, it was in Lily's smile when he helped her brush paint across construction paper, in the way Julia quietly leaned into him during family movie nights, in the peaceful silence that came when all three of them sat at the dinner table with nothing urgent to say. One evening, after Lily had gone to sleep, Blake stood at the window of their apartment and watched the lights of the city shimmer like stars fallen to earth. Julia came up behind him, resting her head against his back. They didn't speak at first. There was no need. Some silences were full, not empty. He turned eventually and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out something small and carefully folded. When he opened his hand, she saw it, a paper crane. Not perfectly shaped, a little uneven, as if folded by someone with large hands and very little practice. Julia laughed softly, remembering the time she used to make them for him when he was buried in stress and pressure. A silent wish for calm. He had never believed in such things back then. But now, he looked at her with eyes that were no longer guarded and said, "I made this after Lily's first school play. I don't know what I'm doing half the time, but I know I want to keep doing it, with both of you." It wasn't a proposal, not exactly. It was a confession, a promise, a new beginning. Julia didn't answer with words. She simply took the crane, turned it gently in her fingers, and placed it on the windowsill beside the one she had made years ago and secretly carried with her across every move, every hard year. Weeks passed, and with them came a rhythm that felt less fragile and more like something permanent. Blake began involving Lily in the smaller rituals of his life, teaching her to make pancakes the way she liked, letting her pick out his ties before meetings, sometimes even letting her sit quietly in his office as he worked, her little legs swinging from a chair too big for her. She'd sit with headphones on, coloring or building puzzles, every now and then glancing up at him with a look that made everything he once thought important fall away. One Saturday morning, they packed up their things and visited the small beach Julia used to talk about when they were young and foolish and had nothing but dreams. It was the first time the three of them had taken a trip together. Lily ran through the sand barefoot, shrieking with delight, and Blake chased her until they both collapsed into laughter. Julia watched them from a blanket nearby, her heart full and aching at the same time. That night, they sat around a fire pit behind a rented cottage, wrapped in blankets, sipping warm cider. Lily fell asleep between them, her head on Blake's shoulder, one of her hands loosely holding Julia's. Blake looked at Julia, the firelight dancing across her face, and said, "This is it for me. I don't need anything else. Not more money, not more titles. I just want more days like this." Julia smiled, tired but peaceful. "Then stop chasing everything else. You've already found what you were running from." The next few months only deepened what they had begun. They moved into a small house outside the city, with a garden Julia tended on weekends and a room Lily filled with drawings and plush animals. Blake stepped back from his corporate role, surprising the board and the world, and chose instead to invest in community projects, especially those supporting single parents. He didn't do it for reputation. He did it because he understood now what it meant to feel alone, and what it meant to be found again. One night, Julia found him sitting in Lily's room long after she'd fallen asleep. He was holding an old photo, one of Lily as a baby, and staring at it with an expression she couldn't quite place. She sat beside him and took his hand. "I missed her first steps," he whispered. Julia nodded. "Yes. But you'll be there for everything after." He turned to her, emotion raw in his eyes. "Do you really believe we can be a family after everything?" She answered without hesitation. "We already are." And they were. Not perfect. Not without shadows. But real. Forged in pain, found again through chance, and rebuilt with intention. In a world full of broken things, they had managed to make something whole. And that, more than any title or fortune, was Blake Walker's greatest success. This story's ending is a quiet triumph, one that doesn't rely on grand twists or perfect redemption, but on something deeper, earned forgiveness, emotional courage, and the slow rebuilding of trust. What makes the finale so satisfying isn't just that the family reunites, but that they grow into something new, flawed, but real. Blake doesn't erase the past, he chooses to rise above it. Julia doesn't forget her pain, she chooses to believe in a future. And Lily, innocent and wise in her own way, becomes the thread that binds them. In a world where so many stories end in distance and missed chances, this one dares to believe in second chances, not as miracles, but as choices. And that, I think, is what gives the ending its emotional weight. It's not perfect. It's better than that, it's human. The Millionaire CEO never made time for detours, until one small-town cafe, a little girl, and a face from his past stopped him cold. Michael Rivers had built his entire life around precision. Every minute of his day was accounted for, every decision carefully calculated, every move leading him closer to more power, more success. At 36, he was the CEO of one of the most profitable construction corporations in the country. His time was too valuable for detours, for spontaneous whims, for moments that didn't push him further ahead. That morning was supposed to be like every other, up before dawn, perfectly pressed suit, conference calls lined up before breakfast, a driver waiting promptly outside. He was on his way to an important meeting with potential investors, already running through his presentation in his mind, when his stomach unexpectedly twisted in hunger. The plan was to make it to the city without stopping, but when he saw a small roadside cafe up ahead, something impulsive overrode his schedule. It was a tiny place, almost invisible if not for the hand-painted sign and a few battered tables outside. Against every instinct, Michael told his driver to pull over. He needed coffee, maybe a quick bite, but more than that, he felt an odd tug in his chest he couldn't explain. The air was crisp as he stepped out of the car, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel lot. The cafe looked like it had been there forever, a weathered building with chipped paint and flower boxes clinging stubbornly to life. Inside, the smell of fresh bread and coffee washed over him, grounding and oddly comforting. There weren't many customers, an old couple in the corner, a trucker sipping coffee at the counter, and a few empty booths. Michael barely had time to scan the room before he noticed her. A small girl, no older than 6 or 7, was weaving carefully between tables, balancing a tray almost too big for her tiny arms. She had long, straight blonde hair that shimmered in the morning light and bright green eyes that seemed almost too vivid for her delicate face. She wore a simple white apron over a faded dress, and though her movements were careful, he could see the natural clumsiness of a child doing a job much too big for her. She approached him with a shy, determined smile and held out a menu with her small hand. "Good morning, sir," she said softly, voice rehearsed but warm. For a moment, Michael couldn't find his voice. He stared at her, something tightening painfully in his chest without warning. Those green eyes, they were hauntingly familiar. As he took the menu, trying to gather his thoughts, his gaze drifted behind the counter, and that was when he saw her. The woman who had once been his whole world. Haley. She was older now, thinner, the lightness in her once carefree posture replaced by a quiet, tired strength. Her brown hair was pulled back loosely, and though exhaustion was written across her face, there was no mistaking her. She looked up and met his gaze, and in that second, the years between them collapsed. Michael froze. So did Haley. The world around them, the clinking of dishes, the low hum of conversation, seemed to vanish. For a few heartbeats, there was only the two of them and the undeniable, shattering recognition in their eyes. Michael's heart pounded against his ribs, his mind scrambling to make sense of the sight before him. He hadn't seen her in 7 years. He hadn't heard from her. He had moved on, or so he thought. And yet, here she was. Working in a rundown cafe, raising a little girl who looked so much like her. A girl with green eyes, his eyes. Michael sat down in the nearest booth, not even registering what he was doing. His hands shook slightly as he placed the menu on the table, though he quickly hid them beneath it when he noticed. He tried to steady his breathing, to focus, to find logic in a situation that made none. Across the room, Haley handed a plate to the trucker at the counter, her movements mechanical, as if her mind were somewhere else. Maybe she was trying to pretend she hadn't seen him. Maybe she needed to gather her strength before coming over. He couldn't blame her. He didn't know what he would say either. The little girl came back with a glass of water, carefully setting it down in front of him with a sweet smile. Michael managed to thank her, his voice low and rough. She beamed at the praise, her face lighting up so much it almost hurt to look at her. She didn't seem afraid or wary. To her, he was just another customer. He wanted to ask her 1,000 questions, her name, her age, her favorite color, whether she liked pancakes or waffles better, whether she knew anything about the man who had unknowingly abandoned her before she was even born. But he said nothing. It wasn't his place. Not yet. Finally, Haley wiped her hands on a towel and walked over. She stood across from him, her shoulders tense, her eyes guarded. She didn't smile. She didn't offer a friendly greeting. She simply asked, "What can I get you?" Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a subtle tremor buried beneath professionalism. Michael stared at her for a second longer than he should have before clearing his throat. "Just coffee," he said. He hesitated. "And maybe a moment of your time when you're free." Haley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she gave a short nod and left. Michael watched her go, feeling 1,000 emotions churn inside him, regret, shame, anger at himself, confusion at how everything could feel so raw after so long. When the coffee arrived, he wrapped his hands around the mug just to keep himself grounded. The little girl stayed busy, wiping tables, bringing napkins to the few customers still lingering. She chatted politely with them, her bright spirit undeniable even in the modest surroundings. Michael caught himself smiling despite the heaviness in his chest. She was so full of life, so innocent to the hardships pressing down on her young shoulders. It was clear she wasn't just helping for fun. She was part of the running of this cafe, likely because Haley had no one else to rely on. And the realization sent a bolt of guilt through him so sharp it almost left him breathless. He didn't know what their story was, not really. But he knew enough. He knew that if she was his daughter, and every fiber of his being screamed that she was, he had missed 7 years of her life. First steps, first words, scraped knees, birthday candles. Lost not because fate had stolen them, but because he had chosen ambition over love all those years ago. When Haley finally returned, she sat down across from him without being asked, folding her hands carefully in her lap. She looked tired. Older. But still heartbreakingly beautiful. And still carrying so much strength. Michael put down his coffee, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "How old is she?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Haley exhaled slowly, her eyes softening but never losing their guardedness. 6.5, she said. The words hit him like a hammer. He did the math in his head without needing to. She had been pregnant when he left. She hadn't said a word. And he had been too blind to look back, too convinced that walking away was the smart thing, the necessary thing. "She's mine, isn't she?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Haley nodded once, a small, sad gesture. There were no accusations in her eyes. Only a quiet acceptance of what had been lost. Michael swallowed hard, his world shifting under him as he realized the depth of everything he had missed, and the even deeper truth that it might not be too late to be the man he should have been from the start. Michael sat frozen in his seat, gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had prepared himself for many negotiations, for boardroom battles with some of the fiercest minds in business, but nothing had prepared him for this conversation. Nothing could have prepared him for the simple, devastating truth sitting right in front of him. Haley watched him with an expression that was both gentle and firm, giving him space to process it all without pushing, without recrimination. It only made him feel the weight of his mistakes more sharply. He glanced over at the little girl, who was now giggling softly as she tried to balance 2 plastic cups on a tray twice her size. She was beautiful, radiant, full of a life he had never even glimpsed until this morning. There was no doubt anymore. She had his green eyes, his stubborn chin, the same slight dimple that only appeared when she smiled wide enough. And in that moment, Michael understood with absolute clarity that no business deal, no financial empire, no trophy of success could ever matter more than what he had already lost and what he still might save. When he turned back to Haley, his voice was quieter, more raw. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, though a part of him already knew the answer. He remembered who he had been back then, hungry for more, desperate to prove himself, blind to everything that didn't fit into the plan he had drawn for his life. Haley's hands twisted together in her lap before she spoke. "Because you made it very clear," she said, her tone gentle but unwavering. "You didn't want anything slowing you down. You had your path laid out, Michael. I didn't fit into it anymore. And I thought if I told you about her, you would have felt obligated. I didn't want our daughter to be someone's obligation. She deserved better than that." Her words hit harder than any accusation could have. He hadn't just walked away from Haley, he had unknowingly walked away from his own blood, from a life that might have grounded him, saved him from becoming so hollow inside. He felt the urge to apologize, but the words seemed too small for the damage that had been done. "I didn't know," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I know," Haley said softly. "But knowing now, what are you going to do?" The question hung between them like a heavy weight. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a door, cracked open, waiting to see if he had the courage to walk through it. Michael sat back, breathing slowly, thinking harder than he had in years. The easy choice would have been to walk away again, to tell himself it was too late, that the damage was irreparable. But looking at Haley, at the little girl stacking sugar packets into a tower at the next table, he knew he could never make that mistake again. "I want to know her," he said finally, the word steady, his decision absolute. "I want to be part of her life, if you'll let me. Both of your lives." Haley looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his. She didn't say anything right away, and he didn't rush her. He knew trust wouldn't be rebuilt in an instant. He had to earn it, day by day, word by word, action by action. Finally, she gave a small nod. Not a full agreement, not yet, but a beginning. Michael exhaled slowly, feeling something inside him begin to shift. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing after success. He was chasing after something real. Something that could never be measured in dollars or deals. And for the first time in his adult life, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The following days moved with a kind of strange slowness, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis and Michael was still learning how to walk on it. Every morning, he found himself pulling into the gravel parking lot of the little cafe without even thinking about it. His driver, at first confused, quickly learned not to question it. Michael no longer wore his suits and polished shoes here. Instead, he arrived in jeans and rolled-up sleeves, trying to shed the layers of his old life piece by piece. He would sit at the same corner table and wait for her, the little girl with his eyes, to bring him a menu she knew he didn't need anymore. At first, Sophie, as he had finally learned her name, treated him like any other customer, polite but distant. Haley remained cautious too, always keeping a watchful eye, never fully relaxing. But Michael did not push. He let the moments build themselves naturally. He helped when the cafe got busy, carrying plates, wiping tables, changing the light bulb that flickered near the counter. He stayed late enough to stack chairs and sweep the floor when Haley's exhaustion became too obvious to hide. It was small things that began to open the door between them. One afternoon, Sophie tripped over a loose mat and scraped her knee. Michael was the one who picked her up and carried her to a chair, his heart hammering with protective panic. He cleaned the wound gently while she sniffled, and he didn't let go until she smiled again. That night, Haley thanked him quietly as she locked the door behind the last customer, her voice softer, more real. Sometimes Sophie would sit with him during the slow hours, coloring pictures and explaining the rules of made-up games with deadly seriousness. She told him about her favorite animal, horses, her favorite ice cream, mint chocolate chip, and her dream of becoming a ballerina. Michael listened to every word like it was the most important business meeting of his life. He learned that Haley had kept the cafe after her parents passed away, struggling to make ends meet alone. He learned that there had been offers to buy the land, to turn it into a gas station or a mini-mart, but she had refused every time. This cafe wasn't just a business. It was a promise to herself that she could build something stable for her daughter with her own two hands, even if it meant constant worry, even if it meant exhaustion. Michael began to see the small cracks beneath Haley's strength, the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking, the nights she stayed up balancing the cafe's books by hand, the deep sighs she let slip when she thought she was alone. He wanted to fix everything immediately, to throw money at the problem and make all the pain go away. But he knew that would only insult her. Haley didn't want a savior. She wanted someone who would stay. One evening, after closing, Haley handed him a mug of coffee and sat down across from him. The windows were dark, the tables wiped clean, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. She studied him over the rim of her cup. "You're different now," she said finally, almost like an accusation but softer. "Not the man who left." Michael met her gaze without flinching. "I'm trying to be," he said. "I don't know if it's enough. But I know it has to be real." Haley looked down at her cup, her fingers tracing the chipped edge. "She deserves someone real." "I know," he said. "So do you." There was no dramatic reconciliation, no grand declarations. Just two people sitting in the soft quiet of a battered cafe, slowly stitching together a fragile, necessary trust. Michael realized that night that change wasn't a single act or decision. It was 1,000 small choices, made over and over again, to stay when it would be easier to walk away. And he had never been more certain in his life that he would stay. As summer deepened, Michael's connection to the cafe and the small family within it grew stronger. The days no longer felt like interruptions to his real life, they felt like his life. Meetings were rescheduled or cancelled altogether, important calls were pushed to the margins of his calendar, and somehow the empire he had once believed needed his constant attention continued to function without his every breath. Each morning he drove himself instead of using a chauffeur, arriving at the cafe before the doors even opened, ready to help Haley set up tables, fill salt shakers, and brew the first pot of coffee. Sophie would run to greet him with an enthusiasm that squeezed his heart every time, her little arms wrapping tightly around his waist, her trust growing without demands or conditions. Michael learned the rhythms of the cafe as intimately as he once knew the rhythms of the stock market. He knew which regulars liked extra butter with their toast, which ones needed a quiet smile but not conversation. He learned how to make the coffee the exact way Haley liked it, strong but not bitter, with just a splash of milk. He learned Sophie's moods, when she needed laughter and when she needed someone simply to sit quietly and color beside her. Slowly, the walls between them all thinned until they barely existed. But it wasn't just the work or the routines that tethered him to this new life. It was the moments in between, the sight of Haley brushing a strand of hair behind her ear while taking an order, the feel of Sophie tugging his hand to show him a crayon masterpiece, the quiet smiles exchanged over tired but happy breakfasts after the rush of customers ended. These small, seemingly ordinary moments accumulated into something profound, something that made his former world of boardrooms and bonuses feel shallow by comparison. Despite the growing closeness, Michael knew better than to assume everything was forgiven. Haley was still guarded sometimes, especially when talk drifted too close to the future. She never asked for promises, never demanded plans, and Michael understood that after so much history between them, trust was something he had to earn slowly. Not with grand gestures, but with consistency, with showing up again and again, no matter how small the task. One afternoon, after the cafe had closed early due to a thunderstorm, they all sat together in the kitchen, playing a battered old board game Sophie had insisted on rescuing from the back storage room. The rain hammered against the windows, and the overhead lights flickered once or twice, but inside it was warm and bright. Sophie laughed every time Michael lost a turn, her joy so infectious that even Haley laughed openly, without hesitation. It was during one of those easy, laughter-filled moments that Sophie asked the question Michael had both feared and longed to hear. "Mr. Mike," she said, leaning over the board with wide, serious eyes, "are you gonna be my dad one day?" The room seemed to still, the hum of the refrigerator, the patter of rain, everything dropping away into silence. Michael felt Haley's eyes on him, felt the weight of everything in the world settle onto his shoulders. He looked at Sophie, her innocent face full of hope, and then at Haley, whose expression was unreadable but whose eyes shone with unshed tears. Michael didn't rush his answer. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table so he was at Sophie's level, and spoke with quiet honesty. "I would love nothing more," he said. "But it's a big decision, sweetheart. It's something your mom and I have to talk about and work through, so we can do it right. Because you deserve it to be right." Sophie nodded solemnly, seeming satisfied, and went back to her game. Haley remained silent, but when Michael dared to glance at her again, she gave him the smallest, almost imperceptible nod of approval. A beginning. A fragile, precious beginning. That night, after Sophie was asleep in the small room above the cafe, Michael and Haley sat outside on the back steps, a thin mist still hanging in the air after the storm. They didn't speak for a long time. They simply existed side by side, breathing the same cool night air, watching the stars blink uncertainly through the cloud cover. Finally, Haley broke the silence. "You really meant it," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Michael turned his head to look at her, no hesitation in his voice. "With everything I have," he said. And for the first time, Haley leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, letting him carry some of the weight she had held alone for far too long. Summer slowly faded into the first crisp days of autumn, and with it came a new kind of settling, one that Michael had never experienced before. The chaos of city life, the endless chase for more, the cold luxury he had once wrapped himself in, all of it felt so distant now, almost like a life he had watched someone else live. The cafe had become more than just a place he visited, it was home in every way that mattered. Haley had opened a space for him in their lives, not with grand gestures or emotional declarations, but with simple, daily trust, the kind that was earned, not given freely. Sophie now ran to him without hesitation, her arms flung wide every time she saw him, her giggles lighting up the entire room. She began calling him Dad, sometimes without even realizing it, slipping the word into casual conversations, as natural as breathing. The first time it happened, she was coloring a picture of their little cafe family and simply said, "This one's you, Daddy," without looking up. Michael's heart had clenched so hard it had been difficult to breathe, but he had managed to smile and nod, his voice steady even though everything inside him trembled with emotion. Haley saw it too. She saw the way Sophie had stitched Michael into the fabric of their lives as if he had always been there, and though it scared her, it also softened her. Their conversations grew deeper, quieter, filled with the kind of openness that only comes from shared vulnerability. They spoke about the hard years Haley had survived alone, the nights she stayed up worrying how she would pay the bills, the mornings she cried in the shower so Sophie wouldn't hear. Michael listened, every word cutting deeper into the old wounds he carried, but he never once interrupted or tried to make excuses. He knew silence could be an apology too, if it was filled with understanding and not pride. Sometimes after Sophie went to bed, they sat together in the cafe's small back office, sorting through paperwork or sipping coffee in comfortable quiet. Other nights, they simply leaned against the counter and talked about nothing at all, about books they never finished reading, about places they once dreamed of visiting, about silly things Sophie had said during the day. These moments were ordinary on the surface but sacred underneath, stitching together the rift between them with careful, invisible threads. As the season changed, Michael made small changes of his own. He officially stepped back from his role as CEO, moving into a chairman position that required far less of his daily attention. The board was stunned, but he didn't care. For the first time, he wasn't chasing more. He was protecting what he had found. He didn't announce it to Haley, didn't present it like a grand sacrifice. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about making space, clearing a life cluttered with noise to make room for something real. One particularly cold evening, Haley surprised him by asking if he wanted to help redecorate the cafe for the fall festival the town hosted every year. He said yes immediately, even before she finished the question. They spent the afternoon untangling strings of orange lights, hanging paper leaves from the ceiling, and arranging pumpkins Sophie had painted with messy, colorful faces. It was the kind of day that was sticky with laughter and small frustrations, the kind of day that mattered more than all the important meetings he had ever attended combined. When the decorating was finished and the cafe glowed warmly against the early dusk, Haley stood beside him, arms crossed, surveying their work. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she said, "Thank you for not giving up this time." Michael didn't answer with words. He reached over and laced his fingers with hers, a simple, steady promise. And this time, he meant it with every beat of his heart. The morning of the town's fall festival arrived with a bright, cold breeze that carried the smell of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Michael woke up early, earlier even than Sophie, and for a long time he just lay there in the guest room above the cafe, listening to the quiet hum of the small building he had come to love more than any skyscraper he had ever worked in. The sun rose slowly, spilling gold across the wooden floor, and with it came a sense of peace, steady and real, the kind he had spent his whole life chasing in all the wrong places. Downstairs, the cafe was already buzzing with life. Haley was tying orange and gold ribbons around the chairs, her hair pulled into a loose braid, a few strands falling around her face. Sophie was running from table to table, making sure each pumpkin she had decorated was perfectly placed, her cheeks flushed pink with excitement. Michael joined them quietly, slipping into the rhythm without needing to be asked. They were a team now, moving together, laughing softly at little mistakes, their movements easy and sure. As customers began to trickle in, the small cafe transformed into a hub of laughter and music, the air thick with the smell of cinnamon and baking bread. Michael manned the small cider stand Haley had set up outside, serving steaming mugs to townspeople who greeted him like he had always been part of the community. No one treated him like a millionaire or a CEO. They treated him like Michael, the man who helped clean tables, who repaired the broken chair last week, who stood in the cold smiling because he wanted to, not because he needed to impress anyone. In the middle of the afternoon, while Haley was inside handling a rush of customers, Sophie tugged at Michael's hand and pulled him toward the little stage set up near the fountain. A group of children were gathering there, preparing for a small talent show. Sophie, cheeks pink with nervous energy, whispered that she had signed up to sing. Michael knelt down to her level, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and told her that no matter what happened, he was proud of her. Her eyes lit up with that pure, fierce happiness only a child can show, and she threw her arms around his neck before running off to take her place in line. Michael found Haley just as the first performers started, and they stood together at the edge of the crowd. The small stage was framed by trees just starting to turn amber and red, and in the center of it all was Sophie, clutching a small microphone with both hands. When the music started, her voice was small and shaky at first, but as she found the melody, it grew stronger. She sang about family and belonging, about finding your place, about holding on when the world feels too big. Her voice wasn't perfect, but it was filled with so much heart that Michael felt something crack open deep inside him. He looked at Haley and found tears shining in her eyes. Without thinking, he reached for her hand, and this time she didn't hesitate. She laced her fingers through his, squeezing tightly as if she needed him as much as he needed her. In that moment, it didn't matter what had come before. The missed years, the pain, the choices they wished they could take back, all of it was part of the path that had led them here, standing together under a sky heavy with autumn light, watching their daughter sing the story of their new life. When Sophie finished, the crowd erupted into applause, and she beamed, her whole face glowing. She jumped off the stage and ran straight into Michael's arms, nearly knocking him over with the force of her hug. He lifted her high into the air, laughing, and when he set her down, she grabbed Haley's hand too, pulling them both close. They stood there for a long time, the three of them tangled together, and for the first time in his life, Michael understood that real success had nothing to do with money or titles. It was right here, in the small arms wrapped around his neck, in the tired but radiant smile on Haley's face, in the weightless feeling of knowing he had finally made it home. The first frost came early that year, covering the grass and rooftops in a thin layer of white that shimmered in the morning sun. Michael woke up with Sophie curled against him on the couch, a forgotten picture book still open on his lap. Haley was asleep in the armchair nearby, her head resting against the back of the seat, her legs tucked underneath her for warmth. The cafe had closed early the night before, giving them a rare evening to just exist without customers or obligations, and somehow the quiet moments had stretched into sleep without anyone even realizing it. Michael stayed still for a moment, breathing in the soft, steady rhythm of his daughter's sleep, feeling a kind of contentment he had never known before. He eased himself up carefully, carrying Sophie to her small bed upstairs, tucking her in with the practiced care that had become second nature. When he returned to the living room, Haley was awake, blinking sleepily at him. She smiled, slow and genuine, the kind of smile that felt like it belonged only to him. He crossed the room and sat down beside her, taking her hand without a word. They stayed like that for a long time, listening to the creaks of the old building settling around them, the whisper of the wind outside, the beating of hearts that no longer raced out of fear or doubt but moved steadily forward together. Later that morning, Michael drove them into town for breakfast at the small diner they had started frequenting on Sundays. Sophie chattered in the back seat, recounting every tiny detail of her school week with the breathless enthusiasm of a child who trusted completely that she was being heard. Michael listened to every word, laughing when she made jokes, asking questions when she got too excited and jumbled her stories. Haley watched him with a soft expression that spoke volumes about how far they had all come. At the diner, the waitress knew them by name now, bringing Sophie's favorite chocolate milk without being asked and slipping an extra packet of crayons onto the table. Michael looked around at the small-town life he once would have scorned for being too slow, too simple, and realized he wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. Not even the billions he once chased with every waking breath. After breakfast, they walked down Main Street, visiting the tiny bookstore where Sophie picked out a fairy tale collection, and then the craft shop where Haley chose new paints for her art projects. Michael bought a battered old chess set from a second-hand store, deciding he would teach Sophie how to play on cold winter nights. They ended the morning at the town square, where a few vendors had set up stalls selling handmade candles, knitted scarves, and jars of local honey. Michael bought a jar for the cafe without thinking twice, laughing when Sophie insisted on trying a sample from every booth. As they walked back to the car, Sophie skipped ahead, twirling with the boundless energy only children seem to have. Michael slowed his pace and reached for Haley's hand. She intertwined her fingers with his easily, naturally, as if she had been waiting for him to do it all along. "I'm scared sometimes," Haley said suddenly, her voice quiet but steady. "That this could fall apart. That you'll wake up one day and realize you want something else again." Michael stopped walking, pulling her gently to a halt with him. He turned her to face him, brushing a strand of hair away from her eyes. "There's nothing else I want," he said with quiet certainty. "There's nothing else I'll ever want again." Tears welled in Haley's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, smiling instead, a little shy, a little amazed. Michael leaned forward and kissed her forehead, a tender promise written in every movement. When they reached the car, Sophie was waiting, bouncing on her toes, her arms full of treasures she had collected along the way. She grinned up at them, completely secure in the knowledge that they would always come back to her, that they were hers as much as she was theirs. Michael opened the car door and helped her climb inside, fastening her seatbelt with a care that was second nature now. As he turned back to Haley, he realized that what they had built, piece by fragile piece, was stronger than anything he had ever created with concrete or steel. It was love that didn't shout but endured. It was family, unexpected and imperfect and absolutely perfect in its own way. As he slid into the driver's seat and started the car, Michael caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rearview mirror. He didn't see the cold, driven CEO he used to be. He saw a man who had nearly lost everything without ever knowing it, and who had somehow been given the extraordinary chance to find it again. He smiled and drove them home. What I love most about the ending of this story is how deeply earned it feels. It's not about dramatic gestures or sweeping promises, it's about quiet choices made every single day, about building something real from broken pieces. Michael's journey shows that true success isn't measured in wealth or status, but in the relationships we nurture, the forgiveness we ask for, and the love we are brave enough to fight for. The ending feels powerful because it reflects life honestly, imperfect, slow, and sometimes scary, but full of second chances if we're willing to reach for them. Michael, Haley, and Sophie don't find a perfect fairy tale. They find something better, family, built on trust, resilience, and everyday love. In my view, it's the kind of happy ending that matters most, because it's the kind that could happen in real life, and that makes it unforgettable.